live now in our Brisbane studio from the Chamber of Commerce and Industry Queensland, Diane Petrie, and of course, State Political Affairs Editor at the Courier-Mail, Stephen Wardill. Now, guys, tomorrow's a big day for Jackie Trad, the Treasurer of Queensland. She'll be bringing down the annual budget. There's some headwinds that have emerged. There's no doubt about that. OK, Stephen Wardill, what can we expect from the budget?
Well, I think the central proposition that Jackie Trad has been setting up now for the past couple of weeks is this is a budget where they're going to borrow to build. It's something we saw the Andrews government do quite successfully in Victoria. But the key difference in Queensland, of course, is we are carrying much more state debt than what they are in Victoria, much more than what they are in almost every other state bar Western Australia on a per capita basis. So the state does have some significant difficulties, particularly given revenue is declining. In stamp duty, for instance, $1.3 billion has been wiped off the forward estimates already. I think the figure on GST is somewhere around $800 million. So while the central proposition is we need to borrow to build, I think in some ways it's really to borrow to keep things afloat, because they've lost a hell of a lot of revenue, even though they're raking in record amounts for coal royalties. At the same time, their expenses have gone through the roof. It was always a budget predicated on some pretty rubbery figures, I thought, over the next 3 years, particularly when you had a look at their expenses growth moving forward, where they were projecting something like 1.5, 2.2%, where over the past 3-4 years, they've managed to grow expenses by something like 6.5%, 7%. So it was really against type that they were proposing balanced budgets, and I think because of the fall in revenue that they've experienced, this whole kind of borrow to build argument has emerged.
Dan, the Treasurer is saying that the government will deliver a surplus. I mean, is that smoke and mirrors when you consider that, as Stephen said, the borrowings have gone up quite, significantly?
There's certainly an element of that. Now, Steve was quite right to talk about, the debt pile. It will not go away. Now, in the Andrews Victoria case, they sold Victorian ports down there, Melbourne ports, to fund that expansion. That was received very, very well. Mike Baird actually went to an election, promising to do leasing of assets, and of course that's where you own the underlying physical structure, and you effectively let the private sector take care of the maintenance. The simple fact is, for the Treasurer Trad tomorrow, it's about articulating a narrative about growth. Now, on every key economic indicator, business confidence in the state is at pretty much an all-time low, particularly over the last decade. The intention of hiring is low. The run rate of actual construction investment, so the value of work to begin, is running at half of what it was a decade ago. So in light of that, the question then begs, if you run a surplus, even if you invest a small surplus in those initiatives, it's still very, very difficult. You're still 1% behind in terms of the national rate of unemployment. Like New South Wales and Victoria create 85% of the jobs in the last 12 months. We're a laggard, and we've got problems, and we need to address the simple fact is, if the private sector is not functioning and not firing, you've got problems.
Now, of course, the Palaszczuk government firmly believed that Bill Shorten would be at the lodge by now, and they actually took contingencies to ensure that this fiscal document reflected that, Stephen Wardell. I mean, one of the biggest items is, of course, the Cross River Rail. Now, there's a $2.5 billion black hole attached to that. How do they get around that sort of drama and problem?
Yeah, my understanding is immediately after the federal election, all the Treasury boffins got called in and they started rewriting the budget, that some red lines started to get drawn through a whole bunch of infrastructure. You're right about Cross River Rail. It's a massive project. Bill Shorten was promising, I think, $800 million up front in the way of capital, and the rest of the money in the way of helping out in terms of the cost of running this project, because it is going to be a costly ongoing operating expense for the budget. But there's other money as well, which he was promising. For instance, $100 million for the Mount Isa to Townsville railway line, which we saw Jackie Trad up in Townsville yesterday talking about reform there as well. Nowhere near as much money, but I think other deals as well when it comes to health, education, Indigenous housing, all areas where they were expecting a federal government led by Bill Shorten to take a bit more of the share to free up funds. Now, like I was saying before, because of these lack of funds coming through in terms of revenue, but now in terms of what they can expect from the federal government, they're moving to this borrow to build argument to try and get through for the next couple of years.
Dan, this $80 billion debt by 2020, it's a massive amount of money. Campbell Newman went to the electorate with the privatisation proposal. He was soundly beaten. That's why Anastasia Palaszczuk is there. The Labor government will in no way entertain the thought of selling off private assets. How does Queensland get its burgeoning debt under control?
Well, in the absence of not doing that, you start to go into the realm of hope being a strategy. And it might be like if we get an external shock. Now, in case anyone's not aware, there's a bit of tension between China and the United States at the moment. That has a significant negative impact on the overall budget. Now, of course, the state's ability to borrow is predicated as currently AA+ at the moment. Now, every time, if you start getting into the purview of having a downgrade, you're then even more constrained about what you can do. So the simple fact is, that a conversation at some point will inevitably have to have, no matter who occupies the Treasury benches. And, of course, the federal government did offer a carrot many years ago to sign up to an asset recycling program. That is part and parcel of state governments throughout Australia being able to do that. State governments don't raise enough revenue. And otherwise, to be able to fund all their promises, they rely on the GST. So, in the absence of any root and branch, tax reform or for that matter, asset recycling, you've certainly got a millstone around your neck, proverbially speaking.
I think it's going to take almost another global financial crisis to convince the politicians in Queensland to sell assets and to get rid of some of this debt, because you've also got the LNP at the moment who are saying that they will not sell assets either. After the 2015 election, when the Newman government went to Queenslanders with their huge proposal, I think it was something along the lines of $30 billion worth of assets they were proposing to sell, got rejected. There's political consensus in Queensland now that Queenslanders don't want asset sales. So I think until you get to a point where one side or another is willing to take a proposal to Queenslanders and say, we will sell these assets, but we will buy these assets, it's just not going to happen.
Steve, another big national issue, but of course very much part of the Queensland political landscape, is the Adani project. Are you expecting the groundwater components to be signed off on Thursday and the Adani project to be given the green light in the next week or so?
Yeah, well, Thursday is D-Day for the Carmichael coal mine. After 8 years and countless proposals getting put to the government in terms of these plans, Thursday is the day when we find out whether they can go in and start digging. Look, I think the groundwater management plan has always been the one that's most contentious. It is very difficult to find out where these water flows come from. So there has been some advice go back to Adani from CSIRO and Geosciences Australia. They've sent some information back to the Department of Environment this afternoon, from my understanding. So I think in the end the politics of the situation says they have to come to agreement. I don't think the Palaszczuk government can afford for this thing to get knocked over by another hurdle, considering how much pain it's taken from it.
And Dan, we know that right up until May 18, there are a lot of obstacles in the way of this particular project, particularly the Blackthroated Finch and the groundwater stuff. I mean, I find it interesting that the Treasurer of this state, Queensland, reaps $5.2 billion a year in mining royalties from the Galilee Basin, and yet they were so vehemently opposed to this until Bill Shorten was soundly beaten at the federal election off the back of some stunning results in Queensland. I mean, surely the Treasurer, Jackie Trad, has got the memo on job creations in the regions.
Well, it doesn't come much clearer than that federal election result. Now, of course, in a previous life, I used to be in your position, talking about the business of the day, and that was up in Asia. So, like, again, when these things play out, it's a terrible look for Australia in terms of the ability of being open for business. That's the first problem you have to deal with. And secondly, of course, you get crippling business confidence if there's obfuscation or the perception of that within the government. So, of course, for Treasurer Trad, again, it's another obstacle she'll have to overcome. And again, that's what makes this budget very difficult. How does she actually create a narrative that's going to encourage the private sector, the people I represent effectively, to invest and be able to make those decisions? And of course, the Adani mine, for you like, is certainly coming down the railway.
Dan, you're seeing how tough the regions are doing it. Now, I just spoke about airline flights. I just spoke about regional airline costs and the tyranny of distance that people in the bush have to put up with in this country. I I mean, surely the government needs to intervene at some point and try and sort of mitigate against these costs. $1,400 from Longreach to Brisbane. You can go to Los Angeles for cheaper from Longreach. I mean, it's extraordinary. How do we tackle this?
Well, in the absence of actually having a market solution, it's clear from this report that we don't have a market solution.
Yes.
And of course, the airlines sign up. Of course, when Qantas was sold off by the Labor Party in the 80s, of course, they had to observe what was called the Qantas Act. In fact, every airline which operates in this country has to observe, the laws and regulations, and part of that's a component where there are loss-making routes. But of course, there are subsidies there. But if there is a problem in terms of market failure, that needs to be addressed. And of course, unfortunately, in the absence of a private sector solution, the government has to step in.
What do you think, Steve?
I did a quick check before I came on, Gleeso, and if I fly to Mount Isa tomorrow and come back the next day, it's going to cost me more than $1,000. If I want to fly to Sydney tomorrow and come back the next day, I can do it for about $210. So there's a huge disparity there. Now, obviously, there's an economy of scales argument when it comes to flying to Sydney. There's a lot more passengers, so it reduces the price. But these routes are subsidised heavily already, and I think Dan's right. There is no market solution here. But is it possible to start looking at some competition up there? Will that actually help? I don't know, but I think the committee's report where it says we need to open the books here and see whether there is price gouging going on, I'd like to see that, because some of these prices are ridiculous.
They are ridiculous indeed.
Can I just add just quickly that there's also the opportunity too, if you do look at these routes again, about the possibility of, like the Cairns routes now, which go into Asia, have been able to add freight to their existing, what they do for business now, and that's become quite profitable. So there is an opportunity, particularly around ag and those products, to look at. So again, it's not all just let's throw the baby out with the bathwater in this one.